America's trade deficit has become a hot topic in US politics. Neither Democrats nor Republicans like it, both because they see it as a symptom of America's deindustrialization and a cause of America's economic dependency on China. But despite America's best efforts, both under Trump and Biden, the most recent data suggests that things are actually getting worse, not better. Commerce Department data released last week, for instance, showed that the US goods deficit rose to an all-time high of $153 billion in January alone, as businesses and consumers rushed to import what they needed before Trump's tariffs came into effect. So in this video, we thought we'd explain exactly what a trade deficit is, what causes it, and why Trump's tariffs probably won't fix it. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So let's start by just clarifying, because when politicians talk about trade deficits, they often confuse bilateral trade deficits and overall trade deficits. Bilateral trade deficits describe trade between two countries. If country X has a trade deficit with country Y, it means that country X imports more stuff from country Y than it exports to country Y. An overall trade deficit, on the other hand, describes the relationship between all of a country's imports and all of its exports. If a country runs an overall trade deficit, it means that it imports more than it exports overall. And for their part, the US runs both an overall trade deficit and bilateral trade deficits with most of its trading partners. While Trump generally focuses on the bilateral trade deficits, there's pretty wide consensus among economists that overall trade deficits are more important, largely because the complexity of global supply chains renders bilateral information relatively meaningless. For instance, while the US runs bilateral trade deficits with most countries, it actually runs a trade surplus with the Netherlands. But this isn't because consumers in the Netherlands are buying loads of American goods, but rather that lots of American exports to Europe come through Dutch ports. Similarly, the US-China trade deficit has been reduced by Chinese producers rerouting their exports to the US via third countries like Vietnam, which reduces the US-China trade deficit but increases the US-Vietnam trade deficit. Now, the key thing to understand here is that when a country runs an overall trade deficit, it needs a way to finance that deficit, because it's essentially spending more on imports than it's earning from exports. In the US context, this mainly happens via strong demand for dollar-denominated assets like US stocks and US government bonds, in large part because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Foreigners essentially use their domestic currency to buy dollars to then buy those assets, which pushes up the value of the dollar and allows Americans to import more stuff. A stronger dollar also makes American products more expensive to the rest of the world, and therefore less competitive, which reduces American exports, all widening the deficit. This is why lots of politicians, Trump included, don't like the deficit, because they associate it with American industry's declining competitiveness. Anyway, Trump's plan to reduce the deficit is tariffs. The basic idea here is that by making imports more expensive, you can both encourage American consumers to buy American, thereby reducing imports, and nurture American industry by protecting it from international competition, ultimately increasing exports. A reduction in imports and increase in exports should in turn reduce the overall deficit. Unfortunately, there are reasons to think that Trump's particular brand of tariffs are unlikely to meaningfully reduce the overall trade deficit, though. This is essentially because Trump's tariffs are bilateral. They're focused on individual countries like Canada and Mexico. While bilateral tariffs might make goods from these countries more expensive, as long as foreigners are still pouring money into the US, American consumers will continue to buy imports, just from other countries. This speaks to another problem with Trump's policies. He wants to close the deficit, but he also demands that America's trading partners, like Taiwan and Saudi Arabia, invest money into the US. This might sound like a good thing, but for the reasons we mentioned earlier, more money flowing into the US just means more money to finance the deficit. Another problem with bilateral tariffs is that the tariffed countries might also decide to reroute their trade via some third unaffected country, like China is doing with Vietnam. Furthermore, bilateral tariffs tend to make the dollar stronger, which will actually increase the trade deficit overall, especially if American consumers can still import from other countries. This is for two reasons. Firstly, the tariffs are inflationary and thus invite further interest rate hikes, which makes saving in dollars more attractive. And secondly, tariffs usually hurt the other country's economy more because, thanks to its size, the US economy relies less on international trade than most other economies. This puts downward pressure on the other currency, and because the dollar's value is essentially defined by its position relative to other currencies, therefore pushes up the dollar. This is why, while it's fallen a bit in the past few days as investors fret about a looming recession, the dollar has still been riding high since Trump's victory in November. This all suggests that a better way to reduce the overall trade deficit would be implementing a universal tariff on all goods coming into the US. In fact, this was Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's plan, before he was apparently overruled by Trump. According to the Financial Times, Bessent wanted to introduce a 2.5% universal tariff, and then gradually increase it until the deficit was balanced. Now, the one caveat worth mentioning here is that some people actually think that Trump's tariffs are all part of a plan to force America's major trading partners to agree to a rewriting of the International Trading Order, akin to the Plaza Accord, which was a deal signed by the US, UK, France, West Germany, and Japan under Ronald Reagan in 1985. Like Trump, Reagan was anxious about the US trade deficit, and the Plaza Accord temporarily reduced the deficit by forcing these countries to increase domestic demand in their economies, and therefore their demand for American imports. This prospective deal has been nicknamed the Mar-A-Lago Accord, after Trump's hotel in Florida. Unfortunately for Trump, though, he's unlikely to see this happen again. The Plaza Accord wasn't wholly successful, and it was made a lot easier for Reagan by the fact that America's main trading partners were also its allies. This is no longer true. America's main trading partner today, for instance, is China, and it's hard to imagine the CCP agreeing to this sort of deal. On top of that, it's hard to imagine even America's erstwhile allies signing up. The US doesn't have great relations with its allies at the moment, and at least some commentators think that the Plaza Accord was an economic disaster. In Japan, for instance, lots of commentators blame the Plaza Accord stimulus for creating the massive asset bubble that burst in the 1990s, preceding 3 decades of stagnation. All in all, while the trade deficit is certainly a problem, it's hard to see Trump actually solving it, at least if he sticks with his current policies. If you didn't know, Too Long is our regular physical magazine, with our next issue diving deep into the people who control our world, the 25 most influential people as rated by the TLDR team and you. The next edition contains that entire ranking, as well as articles and long reads about all of the most influential people, the power they hold, and how they wield their immense influence. We also discuss a variety of other topics, from the issues facing Starmer in the UK, to the rise of the new right in Europe, to if peace can really hold in Gaza. These are all topics we discuss in videos, but the reporting you'll find in Too Long is some of our best writing, with us able to spend longer on the stories than is ever possible on YouTube. If you're interested in checking it out and supporting the channel, then you can pre-order a copy right now at toolong.news. There you'll find 2 versions of the magazine, the standard and the premium editions. By buying the premium edition, you not only get the magazine, but you also get about 2 hours of exclusive content where the team debate and discuss their top 25 ranking, as well as reacting to the audience's vote for the very first time.
No. Oh.
Might not be alive by the time this comes out at this point.
You can assassinate
Because
him.
he's old and ill, not as a, you know.
What do you know? You'll also get regular access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen, and get your name printed in the thank you section of the magazine. Whichever edition you want, head over to toolong.news to find out more. And if you subscribe to the magazine using code SUBSCRIBENOW, you'll be able to get a copy for as low as $4.99. Anyway, thanks for your support, because Too Long really does help to fund our journalism year round.